was active in Manitoba politics and was elected NDP Premier of Manitoba in 1981. And after the defeat of the government in 1988, he and Adele moved to Windsor, where he was on the faculty of the University of Windsor. He spoke at our church more or less annually, always in June, and became a member in 2013. After his death in 2015, we decided to continue the tradition of an annual talk on social justice issues, named, of course, in his honor. This year, our Howard Pawley Memorial speaker is Daniel Blaikie, who is also from Manitoba. Born in Transcona in 1984, an elected member of Parliament in 2015, he represents the riding of Elmwood, Transcona. He's a member of the NDP's Building for Better task force and serves as critic for unemployment, this is huge, unemployment, workforce development and disability inclusion, international trade, democratic reform, and is also the deputy finance critic. Okay, so please, Daniel, over to you.
Well, thank you very much. And maybe I'll start by saying a big thank you to the congregation for inviting me into your place of worship, or virtual worship in this case. It's an honor to be with you, and thanks to Bill and Bobby and Reverend Solano for thinking to invite me to participate in the Howard Pawley Memorial Lecture Series, and I extend my greetings to Adele as well, who I'm pleased to have here for this talk. So I'll start with reading, and then move on to my remarks. And the reading today is from Luke chapter 18, verses 1 to 8. And he told them a parable to the effect that they ought always to pray and not to lose heart. He said, "In a certain city there was a judge who neither feared God nor regarded man. And there was a widow in that city who kept coming to him and saying, 'Vindicate me against my adversary.' For a while he refused. But afterward he said to himself, 'Though I neither fear God nor regard man, yet because this widow bothers me, I will vindicate her, so she will wear me out by her continual coming.' And the Lord said, 'Hear what the unrighteous judge says. And will not God avenge his elect who cry to him day and night? Will he delay long over them? I tell you, he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he find faith on earth?'" So I just wanted to express my thanks again for being part of this lecture series. I didn't know Howard very well personally, although we did have occasion to meet a couple of times. I was familiar, of course, with the legacy of his government as a Manitoba New Democrat. They were the first to bring in meaningful pay equity legislation in the country. They added sexual orientation to the Human Rights Code in Manitoba. They brought in first contract legislation, which was important here for workers in Manitoba. And of course, there are many other achievements, but those are some of the things that I knew Howard and his government for. I also, on a personal level, became most familiar with him when I wrote a paper for a class that was eventually published in Manitoba history on the founding of Manitoba Public Insurance. So in Manitoba here, unlike where you are in Ontario, there's only one vendor of car insurance. It's a Crown corporation. And that was an achievement of the Schreier government that managed to lower auto insurance rates, but also keep the premium dollars in Manitoba instead of having them flee to Bay Street or Wall Street. And the capital that was raised through doing public auto insurance here in Manitoba was responsible for having a lot of schools and hospitals and other things built with the money coming from Manitoba ratepayers rather than banks outside of Manitoba. And it's that kind of, I think, creative policy thinking and creative policy solutions, whether it's through public ownership or whether it's through cooperatives or credit unions or social enterprises and some of the many other ways that people have developed over the years to keep economic control in local communities and subject them to democratic control. Those are some of the things that I think we need to be looking for opportunities to build on and to expand as we think about the kind of world that we want coming out of coming out of the pandemic. And Howard, as part of the Schreier government, certainly was a pioneer, one of Canada's pioneers, I think, in that regard. So it's quite, it feels very fitting to be sharing some of these reflections in the context of a memorial series dedicated to him. So I do want to talk about that reading in Luke very briefly before launching into some remarks about the pandemic. Before I do that, I would just offer a disclaimer and make an invitation to the hosts of the service, which is that one of the occupational hazards of politics is that we tend to go on. So at a certain point, if you find that I'm pushing the boundaries of time, please do feel comfortable giving me a 5-minute or a 3-minute or 2-minute warning, just so I can wrap up and not go too far over time. The reason I wanted to talk or provide that reading as a reflection, it's sometimes referred to as the parable of the persistent widow, and there's different interpretations of that parable out there, to be sure. But the way it was taught to me was a lesson about how to relate to temporal authority and the importance of hope and persistence if you want to seek justice. And I have sometimes thought that, and certainly had occasion throughout the pandemic to feel that, that is sometimes the role of the NDP in federal Canadian politics, to be there advocating consistently and persistently for justice. And I think part of the lesson in that parable is that, you don't always win the argument in terms of convincing the government of the day or the person in charge of the, you don't always get them to agree with you in the sense that they own your whole argument or they take it all on or they're perfectly convinced. But persistence does sometimes pay off in terms of getting them to do the right thing, even if it's just to get you off their back or whatever the case may be. And so I think that's partly a story of hope and keeping your hope alive and continue to be persistent and recognizing that even if you feel like you're not getting through maybe in the way that you most want to, which is to change hearts and minds, that we can accomplish a lot of good, even just by being a nuisance sometimes. and that there's value in that, even though it may be dissatisfying in certain ways. So I do have stories to share, and if there is time for discussion and people want me to share some stories about the pandemic and some of the things that have played out in Parliament. I mean, some of the things that we've been persistent about and not always gotten our way in the way that we would like, but I think have made a meaningful contribution to policy on, or things like CERB. Initially the federal government was proposing just to kind of tinker with the EI system, and we know that only about 40% of people working in Canada prior to the pandemic were actually eligible for EI, so it wasn't going to cover enough people, and there was a real need to ensure that as all those other people who wouldn't be able to access employment insurance were falling out of work because of the pandemic, that there would need to be a serious income program there to make sure that they didn't lose their home or failed to put food on the table at the every day. So that was certainly somewhere where we persistently advocated for more. Even as CERB was announced, there were a lot of people left out. I'm thinking in particular of students who often work during the summer in order to pay their tuition. And for many students to be able to pay their rent, I mean, I think sometimes there's a thought out there that students are just kind of kids living in their parents' basements and going to school. But of course, many students have to support themselves as they go through their studies. And so they hadn't stopped working because of COVID-19, because the job that they were hoping to have was to start in April, just a couple weeks actually after things started getting locked down in earnest in order to combat the pandemic. And they were left out of the CERB. So that took some persistence and dedication in order to get the government to deliver on some income assistance for students. Of course, if you've been watching the news in the last couple of weeks, there's been a lot of talk about people living with disabilities and the adequacy of the government announcement on that. That was something that over 2 rounds of negotiation on government legislation the NDP advocated very hard for. I was in those conversations as the disability inclusion critic and the employment workforce development critic for the NDP. And so there were problems with what was announced, but I have no doubt that the fact that anything got announced at all was the result of serious and persistent work and putting that issue front and center, because people living with disabilities, even though they may not have lost employment, did face increased costs. A similar argument was one that we made for seniors, and we saw the government announce some additional funding for seniors. I think what you see in the way that the government of the day chose to respond to the commitments that we got them to make was, and I think part of the difference that I'm going to be trying to emphasize as we discuss the pandemic today is one of approach. And, you know, the government of the day's approach so far, in my view, has been to support people, yes, but to do it in a way that ultimately envisions a return to the status quo. So you see one-time payments, and you see, a lost opportunity, in my view. Seniors are a good example, people living with disabilities, people who, many of whom within those demographic groups, we know were already living at the poverty line or below the poverty line before. We know that Canada has the resources to ensure everybody living here has a life that they can live with dignity, whether they're retired or whether they're living with a disability, whether they're working or whether they can't work. And from our side in the NDP, we do see the pandemic as an opportunity to address some of those structural problems and persistent injustices within Canada. I think one of the things that the pandemic has re-emphasized for many of us is the extent to which we really are in this all together, and that if we're looking out for our friends and neighbors and the people who live in our community, that we're all going to be better off at the end of the day if everybody has a roof over their head and can feed their family and isn't worried about what tomorrow is going to bring, because they know that there's a meaningful social safety net to fall back on. So that's, I think, part of the opportunity that the pandemic represents, is an opportunity to come out of this not by getting back to the normal that we had before, but I think it challenges us to accept what were some serious flaws in the normal that we had prior to the pandemic. And our response to the pandemic should be, we should be talking now about what kind of world we want to live in and what kind of country we want to live in coming out of the pandemic, so that, you know, if you look at the amount of money that's being spent right now out of the public purse, that's not money that we want to have spent and then afterward not be in a better position to create a more just Canada, whether we're talking about social justice, economic justice, or environmental justice. So we want that massive mobilization of public resources to leave us in a much better position with respect to creating all those kinds of justices, or justice in Canada. So so that's why I thought that parable was maybe a good one, because all that is going to take a lot of hope and a lot of persistence. And so when we talk about, you know, what are our goals for after the pandemic and how do we get there, I think some of the obvious ones for me are that, you know, in some ways, I think the pandemic was a little bit of a microcosm for understanding the challenge of climate change. You know, but it all kind of happened on an accelerated time frame. But we heard, you know, warnings about what was coming down the pipe, and public policy suggestions about how to try and limit the spread of the pandemic. It was something that once we started feeling the very real consequences and seeing how immediate the threat actually was, governments were not quite prepared to deal with. And in the same way, governments around the world are not prepared right now to deal with the very real consequences of climate change that are coming if we don't find a way to reduce our carbon footprint and keep global warming in that 1.5 degrees Celsius limit that's been targeted by international groups of scientists who are the leading experts on climate change. So certainly, I think that has to be one of the goals, and I think that's pertinent now because we're already talking about, well, what are some of the ways in which we can stimulate the economy and get people back to work? And I think we have to know and have the resolve as a country that some of that investment has to be in lowering Canada's carbon footprint. And there's a number of ways that we can do that, but that's part of the discussion that I think we ought to be having. And rushing to shovel-ready projects is not necessarily the best way to do that, because those projects aren't necessarily the ones that I think we need to do some planning. We need to design our future as a country if we're going to have a genuinely lower carbon economy and take on climate change. One of the other things that I think we should be looking to is how we reduce poverty. And this ties back to what I was speaking about before: people living with disabilities, seniors who are living on government pensions that are just inadequate to feed themselves and have them have a decent lodging. And this is where I think we're already risking losing some opportunities here. Instead of talking about bringing up disability pensions, whether it's the Canada Pension Plan disability pension or whether it's provincial disability pensions, to a level that people can actually afford the things they need. So far, our government has decided to go with a one-time payment option. And as I say, I think when we talk about some of those added costs that seniors and people living with disabilities have faced, some of them are increased dispensing fees. Now, different jurisdictions have gone through this in different ways and for different periods, but the issue there was that the prescriptions were only being filled for 30 days at a time instead of the normal 90 days, and that meant having to pay more dispensing fees at the pharmacy. Now you can say that that's a problem, and we saw the government admit that finally for seniors and later for people with living with disabilities. And you can say, okay, we're gonna provide a little bit more money as a one-time payment to help people cover that cost. It comes kind of late for that, given that neither of those checks have actually gone out from the federal government so far. But I think the next question is, why is it that seniors in Canada and people living with disabilities are living with incomes where they don't have 20 or 30 extra dollars a month to be able to absorb those kinds of costs? And why is that cataclysmic for them? Why is that putting their apartment or their home in jeopardy? Why is that the difference between having enough food on the table or not? And I think that's already a sign that too many people were living under serious stress. And so then when you say, what's the solution? I think if you acknowledge that it's a problem, that flexibility and that disposable income isn't there to begin with, then you're more inclined to look at a structural solution that actually asks what a just retirement income is and what a just income is for people who are living with disabilities and who aren't able to participate in the workforce. So that's part of what I mean when we talk about building a better normal and using the pandemic as an opportunity to be honest with ourselves about where we were at and where we want to go. A similar thing occurred around workers and extra pay for workers. So it was the NDP that first proposed extra pay for essential workers during the lockdown. But again, you saw a difference in approach. So where we were successful in getting the commitment, the way we wanted to see that commitment realized in terms of respect for essential workers was, first of all, to institute a living wage. So not just to, and I apologize for being less familiar with the way it rolled out in Ontario, but in Manitoba, our government here essentially said, here's the big pot of money coming down from the federal government, and we're going to decide who an essential worker is, and then we're just going to divide the pot by that many people, and we're going to issue a one-time payment. That means that once that money's gone, and whether we're in a second wave or a third wave, whenever it is, eventually things go back to normal. And those people who are looking after our loved ones in long-term care centers, those people who are providing transportation and doing cleaning services, all these jobs that prior to the pandemic we were wont to undervalue, go back to being undervalued. And to me, that's not really learning the lesson. And it's not actually about, at that point, if it's just a one-time payment as a kind of recognition of some of the heightened danger, I think that misses the really important lesson, which is that the work was work of value and it was being systematically undervalued. And the pandemic presented an opportunity for the Prime Minister and premiers to get together and say, if you're doing this kind of work, the best way that we can acknowledge the value of your work and treat you with respect is to, first of all, ensure that you're receiving a living wage for what you're doing. And our proposal beyond that was to offer a courage bonus or some additional pay beyond that. But first of all, make sure that everybody who's working in these positions can go home at the end of the day and know that their paycheck is going to be able to pay for their rent and the food for their family. So that's another illustration of where I think so far we're not absorbing all of the real lessons of the pandemic. And I'm worried that some of those lessons, there are people in politics right now that are working to frame those lessons as just being important temporarily for the pandemic, as opposed to letting them sink in as lessons that should inform not just exceptional periods, but our economy all the time. Better healthcare, of course, is something that I think we've learned a lot about the gaps in healthcare, particularly in long-term care, although not only there. And so why do some of these things matter? Because again, I think as we structure our response to the pandemic, there are things we can be doing now. So I've talked a little bit about income on the side, both of pensions and fair wages. I think one of the other things to really note is that when we talk about how to rebuild after this pandemic, one of the things to know is that this isn't your typical economic downturn. Of course, it's not typical because there's a serious public health issue at the same time. It's not typical because the economy didn't just slow down. It was actually ordered shut by public authorities. But it's also been very different because it has disproportionately affected women. And because, as people come home and kids aren't in school, and we know that a disproportionate amount of the workload at home still falls on women. And it's women predominantly who are wondering about how they're going to make childcare work if they're being called back to work. It's women often who are called upon first to assist in the care of parents and grandparents. And so some of the things that are the kind of normal response to an economic downturn are massive infrastructure investments. And while those may be called for, and I think would be good in terms of a climate action plan, I think our response to this economic downturn really has to go beyond that. And in particular, one of the things that we need to think a lot about is childcare. As the economy gets back going, it's going to be hard, particularly for women, to go back to the level of participation that they had in the economy if we're not making sure that adequate childcare options are there. And we know that across the country, there was already a serious deficit of childcare space, and that's been made worse by the physical distancing provisions that have to be there, given the public health situation. But that means that any particular daycare that was there before can't come back roaring with its full complement of spots. That means we need to create those spots that we're missing from our previous supply, and very likely continue to address what was already a deficit in those spots. So when we talk about childcare, I mean, again, there's options. There's the option to just kind of respond with a quick and dirty, how do we make spots now for the fall? Because, we want to get the economy going as quickly as possible, but it's one-time funding and eventually it's going to fall away as things get back to normal? Or is this an opportunity to say we want to make massive investment in childcare, but we already know that the childcare sector was struggling, in part because it's often it's not a system. It's offered on a market basis, and it's a difficult market because often parents can't afford to pay without any subsidy the cost of what it costs to have somebody be paid well and actually be able to make a living doing early childhood education. And so as we think about how to invest in childcare for the fall, when we're hoping that many people will be going back to work and things will be getting as close to normal as possible in terms of people being at their jobs, this is an opportunity to think about how we build it in a more public and coordinated way, and actually build a system that has a mandate and the funding and the resources to ensure that childcare exists where it's needed in the same way that we do with kindergarten and we do with grade school. We could take a very different approach to ensuring that parents have childcare where they need it, when they need it, at a price that they can afford. If we're willing to recognize that that's important to support families, and that it's an economic investment, not just a cost. And actually, in jurisdictions where they do have good childcare, they've seen much better workforce participation by women, and they've seen a lot of revenue come in through taxes in that as well. So, I mean, these are some of the things that are smart investments. And if we just let the kind of market-dominated philosophy color our thinking and pretend like there aren't other ways of doing things, and this is what I was talking about earlier with the Schreier government and Howard Pawley's work bringing in Manitoba Public Insurance. I mean, that went against the ideology of many people in Manitoba at the time in terms of saying, well, this should be free enterprise and everything else. But it created something that really has been an important public policy tool in Manitoba for decades now, and has allowed us to accomplish many things. And so I think childcare is one of those places where it doesn't have to be publicly owned necessarily, but certainly publicly managed and publicly resourced in order to make sure that people have the childcare they need when they need it. We were just talking, I referred to the Building for Better Task Force, or it was referred to in the introduction. Maybe just explain a little bit of what that is. That's a group that Jagmeet Singh put together. And so there's a few New Democrats from our existing caucus and some previous caucus members, and we've been talking to thinkers and policymakers and frontline workers across the country for months now, talking about this very question, which is how do we not just end up going back to normal and kind of letting inertia carry us back to a status quo that was so broken for so many people? What can we learn coming out of this? Where is there, a kind of public momentum for different approaches that we can harness and carry into a new and better normal that's ultimately more just? And so we were talking to Morna Ballantyne, who's with the Child Care Now coalition group, and this was some of her feedback in terms of ensuring that federal funding for childcare isn't just a kind of one-off during the pandemic, but really goes into building a system that can work. And that's employment that, if you look at who's employed in childcare today, it's predominantly an industry where women make their career. And so being able to pay childcare workers a living wage, having funds that support that create more employment, those are ways to get women back to work by creating job opportunities. And it's also having childcare spaces is important to get a lot of people back to work anyway. And we're already hearing stories of people who say, I would be willing to go back to work, but I can't do it because I don't have the childcare. And so those are some of the things that I think we need to be thinking about. And I think it is really important. I know that's the work that we're doing in the NEP caucus. That's what we're trying to have inform our proposals to government. And And I think part of that also is an attitude. I mean, as an opposition party, you're always faced with a choice about how you work, and our choice through this period has been not just simply to oppose, but to also propose solutions. It's not just to criticize, but it's to say, okay, well, here's what we don't like about what you're doing, or here's what we think you're missing, and here's how we think you could do something better. And so, I think we've managed to, with just a caucus of 24 members, have a real impact on the overall direction and the kind of response that Canada has mounted. It hasn't been everything that we had hoped for. And I think the difference there, or the threshold that we haven't been able to cross, has been this difference in thinking about whether our response to the pandemic is about holding ground until we can just get back to the way things used to be, or whether our response to the pandemic is about capitalizing on the lessons that we've learned about solidarity, about the need to care for one another, about some of the deficiencies of our social safety net prior to the pandemic, and then how we use the resources that we're deploying now to ensure that when we come out of this, we're taking better care of people in a way that allows us to be more ready for the next crisis, whether that's another pandemic, whether that's what may be coming with climate change if we don't get our act together, or whether it's just responding better to a lot of the socioeconomic challenges that existed before the pandemic, that we ought already to have been doing a better job of addressing. So I hope that honors what I was asked to speak about in terms of pandemic and some reflections. Thank you very much for your patience in listening to all of that. And if there is time, I'm very happy to take a few questions. And if not, that's fine too. So I'll turn it back over to our service directors. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you.